Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and this is the show where you can put your experts to task answering your property related questions. And joining me today are Jermyn and SImone Ritchie, both of Woodstock Legal Services, who are residential landlord and tenant law specialists. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's not very often we have two ladies on the show, so today we're breaking new ground. Let's get straight on with the questioning as we have some quite interesting questions today. Your first one is, although there's been a lot of press about new legislation regarding rentals, it seems to have gone a little quiet now. Is this just parliamentary process or is the government going into reverse on these new regulations? And I guess that would be because of an election being not too far away.
It doesn't feel like it's gone quiet in my world because we're constantly talking about it, but you're right, they've missed the last parliamentary session. So that does delay things quite considerably. So yeah, it's not coming anytime soon, but it's, I'm still expecting it to happen. But yeah, it's a whole process it's got to go through. And that's what people don't tend to understand is there's a whole, stage by stage process of review and there's still lots of debate going on. So it's very unlikely that it's going to finish in the form that we've currently seen it at. I'm
quite interested to know, as a professional set of lawyers, do you get weekly updates on what's going on or does it just land on your desk as a fait accompli?
Bit of both.
Yeah, we keep it very firmly to the ground. But we learned in the pandemic that government were very quick to be making very quick changes like that. So, sometimes it can be quite quick, but I don't think this one will be. This will be a bit of a slow burner with lots of debate going on.
I'm just thinking from a practical point of view. Let's say I'm a client of yours and I come in, you give me some advice knowing full well that maybe over the next 12 months legislation will change things. It must be very difficult to advise in those circumstances.
I think that our main duty and responsibility is to give clients the most accurate and up-to-date information that we can give and manage their expectations. So if we have to caveat with it, this is what the current proposed legislation says, and this is what might happen, and these are the potential outcomes if we're working on that scenario, then they've got the information to hand and they can make an informed decision. The difficult bit is when it's a fast-moving pace and everything's changing. Our job is to try and make that as easy for the client to go on that journey and navigate it.
Yes, a little bit like a surveying practice, really. Again, if you do what's called a red book valuation, you've got to value as of today. That becomes very difficult when you know that 6 months down the line, something is being built right on your doorstep that's going to change the demographics of a particular area. It's very difficult.
And we have the added fun, particularly in the private rental sector work, where you've got case law as well. Yeah. And a lot of our case law, doesn't set a precedent, but it's bumbling around in the county courts. But you still have to understand what's going on in the county courts nationally, because it all filters through to the next judges, to the judges in different courts. So, the sort of decisions they're making. I
love that expression, bumbling around the county courts. I hope you're not showing disrespect to our county court judges.
Absolutely not.
That in itself is an interesting subject. I do often wonder if the courts need to be slightly more specialist. I've come across county court judges in the past. I've been involved in property for over 30 years and you're just thinking, you're not quite 100% up with all this, are you?
Absolutely. I've had it numerous times and you're kind of having to politely educate a judge. They may have been sat on family cases the day before and, there's been huge discussion about whether we have a specialist housing court, which is apparently no longer on the agenda. And I have my reservations about that because that becomes very difficult when you need access to justice. How does a tenant travel to a housing court? Is that fair when you're particularly looking at certain demographics? So, but, with the reforms coming in, training with the judges and making sure they really understand this new legislation and know how to apply it is going to be incredibly important.
Do you think there need to be different courts for different purposes?
We do already though. So we have the business and property court already in existence, which is fantastic because it's a specialist court with specialist judges with that background that will deal with those particular cases, and then they are also a breeding ground for new pilots, for e-disclosure, different ways of working practices. It's far more adaptive, much more technology friendly. Everything is remote based, electronic bundles, but that's not for all property cases. So it's property cases, but a niche within a niche. So what I'd like to see is it more all-encompassing for property matters. But you also have the tribunal. So you've got the property tribunal that will deal with service charge disputes, lease extensions, enfranchisement, other issues, which again, that is being set up to make it more client friendly. So they don't necessarily need lawyers to deal with that. So we have these forums. I just don't think that they're utilised as much as they could be.
I've been in the Rolls building a couple of times, and these outings were before commercial judges, and these judges are really on it, and it's because they are specialist judges in specialist courts. There's just no messing about. I remember going into one and the other side was saying, "My lord, I want to explain." The judge said, "I've read it." And the other side, "Yes, but we want to explain, my lord." He then said, "Are you suggesting I can't read?" It's very precise and very clear. And they're just so on it. They know how to get really to the point. Simone, we're going to ask your question now. I have a tenant whose lease is probably about to expire post the new government regulations coming into force. I'm assuming it's an assured short-hold tenancy. Will the new regulations apply retrospectively to that lease, or only for new leases introduced post the introduction of the new rules?
I'd love to be able to give people that comfort and guidance to say with certainty, this is what's going to happen. I can't. And it's incredibly frustrating. As Carly talked about before, the timetable for when this is going to take place. I mean, even today, it just keeps getting kicked back and kicked into touch.
Goalposts moving.
Changing government with the election, it might be completely off the cards. Who knows? So I can't give anybody any certainty as to what's going to happen. What I can say is that given what's happened with legislation in the past, it's more likely than not that it probably won't have retrospective application, and that there will probably be some sort of transitional period in time. So it'll be enacted from and in place from X date, and then there'll be this transitional period to kind of get everybody up to speed. But what those will be, I don't know.
On a periodic tenancy, is there a finality to the...
Well, this is what they're proposing, that everybody moves to a single periodic system. So no, the idea is that it continues to roll unless it's terminated by one of the set grounds, or a tenant terminates it. And that's the whole purpose, what they're moving towards, to move away from these short ASTs, 6-month ASTs.
But, going back to the late 80s, which probably neither of you remember, Margaret Thatcher brought in short-hold tenancies because landlords wouldn't invest in property because they could never get their property back.
Yeah, and they needed stock and assurance
they
that they would.
Stock and they needed housing. I suppose it was probably one of the most successful revolutionary systems that was brought in, and now seems that the government of the same persuasion is ditching all of that, and we're going back to landlords who, once they've made a commitment and their decision to let, they're stuck with it.
Yeah,
this is why I don't understand it, because I had a trial all about, was it an assured tenancy, was it an assured short-hold tenancy, all about the different mechanisms and what would then happen, and it was so complicated. And then now, to me, it just seems like they're just adding another layer of complexity that doesn't need to be there. And actually, if they looked at and did a full root and branch analysis of the housing market and thought about how people are living nowadays, and people are wanting to do longer term lettings, why not put in the principles that you do in commercial property lettings and I'll have a contract for 5 years, and these are the break options that you can have, and give people a bit more flexibility and fluidity, but also that element of certainty. I know that sounds a bit of a contradiction in terms, but I think there's a lot to be said for how the commercial property market operates. Why can't we transpose some of those positive parts of that into the residential market?
Although I think student accommodation is being taken out of it, isn't it?
Only purpose-built student accommodation, which is a real concern. And there was a huge push for, private student accommodation to be included. And that's a real concern because it's periodic in its nature. You go to university in September and then come the summer, students tend to go home. They want to change friendship groups, who they're living with. So it doesn't tend to want to be a 3-year tenancy. A lot of them are in halls for the first year. And actually, moving to the periodic system could really destroy that process that works pretty well. So, and actually there's a huge push for them to be included, as well as the purpose-built student accommodation.
What about HMOs? Because a lot of HMO landlords use assured short-hold tenancies, don't they? to check their occupants in, but by the nature, it's much more of a transient society, I think.
And I think that's, one of the things that frustrates me, because I think quite often there's a lot of people that are happy to be, quite flexible and transient and don't, this is a huge obsession in this country of owning our own property and stability. But actually, you can work from wherever, and people can just move, and actually that's quite attractive for younger generations. So sometimes I just think there's this obsession with stability and owning your own home and,
Well, the funny thing is it's taken time to move towards the European ethos of renting rather than owning. But of course, that's just as we've left the European Union. All right, well, that's all we've got time for in this half of the show. So join me again after the break when we'll be asking Carly and Simone more of your questions. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time. I'm joined today by Carly Jermyn and Simone Ritchie. They're answering your questions on a lot of the legalities of the property market, which is all a bit beyond me, so I'll just ask the questions. Do the panel think that the new rental regulations, particularly those relating to no-fault evictions, will have a detrimental effect on the investment in buy-to-let properties and therefore cause a further shortage of housing stock?
Yeah, I think the big headline with the reforms is the removal of Section 21. And I think that is a massive concern for people, particularly if they don't understand, what their other options are going to be. And, I think that has given people fear that when they choose that they want to take their property back, they no longer want to invest for various reasons, or they have a difficult tenant, that lack of control is creating quite a lot of fear. And particularly where we've not moving forward very quickly with the reforms, it's the uncertainty. So, some of the data does suggest that, the market is shrinking, the demand is incredibly high. And I think what we're tending to see is less smaller landlords, one-off landlords, when it's quite complex, it becomes quite a headache. There are other ways to invest, safer ways to invest, but more of a growth in bigger portfolio landlords.
So you're thinking it's going to go to either bigger investors or perhaps collectives even?
Perhaps, yeah.
But I don't think that is necessarily a negative, because I think if you have more professionally, that's like large portfolio investment managers doing the rental market, you might get a more structured and more organized approach to it. Whereas if you've got lots of people having just 1 or 2 properties, maybe it's less cohesive. And so I wouldn't automatically think, oh, this is going to be a terrible thing. There's a bit of a watch, wait and see. But I think actually it's the same principle with commercial properties, where you've got large portfolio investment funds and they have the professional agents that market it and manage it all. I think the similar kind of concept will probably come into the private sector.
I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I mean, a bit like estate agents, isn't it? If you can breathe, you can be an estate agent. And if you can buy a house, you can be a landlord. And I'm not sure it's that simple these days.
Yeah, and they're certainly driving towards more of a professionalism of the industry, and, that isn't a bad thing. I'd love it if every landlord I dealt with was, incredibly professional and had their house in order. And it's difficult when you're dealing with those, when it's highly regulated, that don't have the time to focus on it because, they're running other businesses or, they've got a career alongside trying to juggle a couple of rentals. I think the issue it causes is where people become accidental landlords, or they need to be a landlord for a temporary time. For example, you're moving abroad to go and work. You just want to rent out your house for a little period of time. And actually, we're going to see empty housing when there's not enough stock would be incredibly frustrating.
That takes you on to the whole, which is a topic for a different day, the whole Airbnb thing. So if you've got people that are going to do short-term lets, instead of, they might say, oh, it's too much hassle to do like a normal letting, I'll do an Airbnb letting instead because there's less regulation involved. Well, actually, there's talks and musings about bringing in those regulations. I know in London that they're looking to do that to well, then what's going to then happen to the market?
We've already done it here. I mean, since the Olympics in particular, I mean, Tower Hamlets, for instance, I've got a feeling I think it's a £25,000 fine if you do Airbnb here.
But on the flip side, as a tenant, if we've got this single system of periodic tenancies, why would you go and pay a higher rent for an Airbnb if actually you could move into, a lovely house down, Sandbags or somewhere like that they think it's going to be a long-term tenancy, and actually you go there for the summer and day one you hand in your notice, which at the moment they can currently do under the proposed reforms. So you'd go and pay a normal rent rather than a inflated Airbnb. You'd have all the services of an Airbnb as well. And you wouldn't actually. That's the downside. But they could go in and they can create that flexibility at a lower rent.
I'm not a fan of Airbnb or short-term lets. I think the consequences for the service charge of the blocks that they go in. I mean, there is a tendency for those kind of companies to pick on a block heavily. Well, I won't say Airbnb, but that's the principle of the business. And of course, there is little care for the apartments, little care for the common part. Therefore, the renovations come in quicker and stronger and bigger. And then, of course, those companies say, oh, fine, that's all right. We found a new block down the road that we're going to. And the residents are left picking up the cost.
It's also tricky as well because people think, oh, I can just Airbnb my house out, it'll be quicker and cheaper, or my flat. But not realising that with a flat, for example, very often you've got restrictions in your lease as to what, I'm talking the long lease, as to what you can do. They don't realise that doing the Airbnb is in breach of it, and then it can somersault and become this big issue. But I don't think you can ignore that market and the share of the marketplace that it's having. Even as an example, down in Cornwall, they've got loads of issues where places that were being built for the locals that they were renting out to locals or to other people are no longer being rented out because they can make more money on Airbnb. So they just won't give a tenancy anymore. So then if you've got the private sector reforms, I just feel like there's this melting pot of lots of different issues, and I don't know what's going to happen, but I think the landscape is going to significantly change.
And I think you have to be really careful. There's been a case recently that it's presumably started, or this is the landlord's case, and I'm using the term landlord, that as an Airbnb, as a short-term let, but it transcended into a tenancy. And actually they then got sued for quite a significant sum for having failed to comply with their obligations. And it did start life as an Airbnb, but it changed and they ended up gaining security of tenure. And it was a really difficult case and a very expensive one for the landlord.
Yeah. We live in a difficult world.
It's complex, yeah.
We do indeed. Okay, Carly, thank you. Simone, I live in an apartment with 55 years left on my lease. I may in the next couple of years wish to sell, but I'm advised that a buyer being able to secure a mortgage might prove problematic. I understand that there have been changes relating to these lease extensions, so could the panel advise what, if any, these changes are, and what advice they can give on obtaining an extension if it's needed?
So a 55-year lease is kind of quite a time-critical one. The easiest way to explain lease extensions and how they work is think of it like an inverse graph. So the less time that you have left on your lease, the more that you would pay as a premium if you wanted to extend it. If it's anything under 80 years, then you would find it incredibly difficult to get a mortgage. So if you were looking to sell it, any proposed buyer would be more often than not a cash buyer. So they would be a special purchaser that would have an impact on your selling price. And the reason why that's also important is if it's less than 80 years, you would have to pay an additional premium. It's called the marriage value on a lease extension. So there are various proposals in place to effectively streamline the lease extension process, take out elements of the premium, the marriage value, but that has been in conversation for about 4 years now, and there's absolutely no timetable in place for these changes to take place with regards to that specific bit. They've dealt with the ground rent, so new long leasehold interests don't have the ground rent. It's more like a peppercorn that it would be. But the actual lease extension process, I've got no timetable. So what I say to clients would be generally, if you're thinking about lease extensions and you're approaching 80 years or you're under 80 years, find out how much it would cost for the premium and how much if you're looking to sell with it extended or not extended, do the calculations. And if you think it's worth it, then carry on.
Okay, so how do you calculate what it's going to be if you're at 81 or 79 years left?
Sure. So there's a very specific formula in place. You need to get specialist valuation advice. So specialist surveyors that will deal with that for you. And they use a calculation and they will say that this is the parameters as to what we think the premium should be. The general position for lease extensions is that you must have owned the property for 2 years and the lease would have been for 21 years or more to begin with.
Right.
People don't often understand there's really two very important key things and tips that I would always tell to people. If you have a property and you're looking to buy it and you need to extend it, you can get the current owner to start the process and then they can assign that benefit of that notice to you as the potential buyer, and then you can complete the lease extension when you buy it rather than having to wait once you've owned it for the 2 years before starting the process. There's a statutory notice in place. You basically say, I want to pay X for the premium. The landlord essentially says, I will take Y for the premium, and you try and negotiate what the premium should be. And if you can't negotiate it, you go to the tribunal.
This is not a job to do yourself, is it?
Absolutely not. People think about going on a voluntary basis rather than a statutory basis. I would always say go on statutory unless there's some very, very exceptional circumstances. The reason why is because the legislation is in place to protect you as a tenant. So it sets out the circumstances by which you can be liable for costs. If the parties don't agree who's liable for the cost, you can go to the tribunal and get it determined. If the parties can't agree the terms, they go to the tribunal.
Does the landlord have an obligation to let you have that extension?
They have very limited reasons that they can say no. So it might be if there's, I think it's 5 years or less left on the lease, or they're doing a substantial kind of redevelopment. But in 16 years, I've not experienced anybody saying no. It's often just agreeing what the premium amount should be. So that's where it's imperative that you as a client get your team around you. So that's your valuer and your lawyer, and then you work together.
Who has the ultimate right to sort of arbitrate?
It would go to the tribunal.
It
So
would.
instead of going to the court, you go to the tribunal. Again, what we're talking about with regards to getting the right people to do the right job, that's a specialist tribunal that is far more litigant in person friendly. So you don't necessarily need a lawyer. In that sort of circumstance, you could just have your surveyor because it's their evidence that you're relying
Sure.
upon. And it's far more cost effective. And it's also, unlike the court, not overstretched and overburdened. So it's got a much quicker time frame.
Okay, all right. Well, that sounds like fantastic advice. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that's all we've got time for. So a big thank you to Carla Jermyn and SImone Ritchie, both of Woodstock Legal Services. Thank you both very much for coming in. It's
You're
been
welcome.
a pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure having you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for the great advice. Okay, that's all we've got time for today. So join me again next time on Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin. See you then.